Good evening all, and welcome back to Fear Knocks. At night, the Appalachian Trail tightens up fast. The shelters cool, the gap lots empty, and the ridges start carrying quick sounds that don't match anything on the map. Anyone who's run these sections after dark knows the trail feels different. When the last headlamp disappears, a parked truck's clock jumps ahead on a dead battery. A handheld shows full signal, but can't push a single call. 3 sharp steps cross a shelter roof without touching the powder. And a lone headlamp moves up a closed reroute, climbing steady until it cuts out in thick laurel. Tonight's accounts come from SAR rounds, patrol notes, and shelter registers pulled after late-night checks. One report nearly stayed off the record, and you'll know exactly which one when we reach it. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. And keep the bell on. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. It helps the channel grow. All right, let's get into it. I was on a routine patrol, checking a remote trailhead parking lot. It was well past midnight, the air barely above freezing, and a thin layer of frost coated the truck's windshield. My scanner was repeating a garbled Mayday call, a loop that had been playing for nearly an hour. My shift had begun like any other, covering the northern section of the Appalachian Trail. The job involved a lot of driving, checking shelters, and ensuring trailheads were secure. This particular gap trailhead was known for its isolation, a gravel lot carved into the side of a ridge surrounded by dense forest. It was a common spot for overnight hikers to leave their vehicles, and sometimes for trouble to find its way in. The scanner had picked up the distress signal about an hour into my patrol. It was faint, broken by static, and sounded like a recording on a continuous loop. Dispatch had no record of it, and attempts to pinpoint the source had been unsuccessful. I decided to check the nearest potential origin point, which was this trailhead. The drive up the winding highway had been quiet, the only sound the low hum of the truck's engine and the persistent, distorted voice from the radio. Headlights cut through the thick night, illuminating patches of fog that clung to the lower elevations. When I arrived, the lot was empty, save for one older sedan, its windows opaque with condensation. I pulled my patrol truck alongside it, letting the engine idle. The exhaust plume hung heavy in the cold air, a visible cloud against the darkness. I had parked facing the trail entrance, the scanner still crackling with the looped call. The air outside was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I had my patrol notes ready, intending to log the vehicle's details and check the trail register. I sat in the truck, listening to the scanner, trying to discern any new information from the repeating message. The interior was warm, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. My eyes drifted to the dashboard clock, a small digital display glowing green. It read a little past 1 in the morning. I had been sitting there for a few minutes, making sure the looped call wasn't a new, active emergency. The static was consistent, the voice always the same, a low, urgent murmur that never quite formed coherent words. I was about to reach for the microphone to report the continued loop when I noticed the clock. The digital display flickered. Not a normal flicker, but a jump. The time advanced by several minutes, then settled. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light or my own fatigue. I looked away, then back. It happened again. The clock jumped forward, this time by a different increment, perhaps a few minutes more than before. It was not a smooth progression. It was a sudden, irregular leap. I watched it intently. The scanner continued its looped transmission, the sound unchanging. The truck idled smoothly, the engine a steady thrum. There was no other movement in the lot, no other sound from the forest. The isolation felt absolute. I checked my wristwatch, a standard analog model, and then my phone. Both showed the correct time, matching what I knew to be the actual hour. The truck's clock, however, was now significantly ahead, showing a time nearly an hour later than it should have been. I pressed the reset button on the dash, bringing the clock back to the correct time. I watched it. For a few moments it held steady. Then, without warning, it jumped again. This time, it was a smaller increment, perhaps a minute or two. The jumps were not consistent in their duration. They were sporadic, unpredictable. The air in the cabin felt colder despite the heater blowing. I turned off the truck's engine, plunging the interior into near silence, save for the scanner. The looped call continued, a constant low whisper in the dark. I restarted the engine. The clock reset itself to the correct time upon ignition. I let it idle again. The jumps resumed. It was as if the truck itself was experiencing a localized time anomaly, yet everything else around me remained normal. The frost on the windshield did not melt or grow faster. The exhaust plume drifted away at a consistent rate. The sedan parked nearby remained still. The forest was silent, a wall of dark trees. I tried to rationalize it, a faulty electrical system perhaps. But the truck was new, well maintained. No other systems were affected. The radio worked fine, the headlights were bright, the heater was functional. Only the dash clock was behaving erratically. I pulled out my patrol logbook and began to make notes, detailing the exact observations. I wrote down the approximate times of the jumps, the estimated duration of each leap forward. The act of writing grounded me, forcing a procedural approach to an unexplainable event. The cold outside seemed to press in, even through the closed windows. I decided to check the lot camera. This trailhead had a small, solar-powered CCTV system, mainly for monitoring vehicle security. The feed was usually accessible through a secure network connection in the truck. I navigated to the camera interface on my tablet. The live feed showed my truck, the sedan, and the empty gravel lot. The image was clear, illuminated by the truck's headlights. I checked the timestamp on the camera feed. It was accurate, matching my watch and phone. The camera's internal clock was not affected. This meant the anomaly was localized to my vehicle, or perhaps to the immediate area around it. I sat there for a long time, observing. The scanner continued its loop. The dash clock continued its irregular jumps forward. I took a photograph of the dash clock with my phone, capturing the incorrect time displayed. I then took another photograph of my wristwatch, showing the correct time. This was for the report, for the evidence file. The silence of the valley was profound, broken only by the scanner's static and the soft hum of the idling engine. There was no wind, no animal sounds, just the cold and the inexplicable behavior of the clock. It was a quiet dread, a sense of something fundamentally out of place. I eventually reported the incident to dispatch. I kept the details strictly factual, describing the dash clock's erratic behavior and the persistent, looped Mayday call. They logged my report, noting the unusual nature of the observation. I was instructed to return to the station, and the looped call was eventually traced to a faulty emergency beacon in an abandoned cabin further north, a few days later. The cabin had been empty for years, its power source long dead. The beacon was found buried under debris, its signal weak and distorted, somehow reactivated by unknown means. My truck was thoroughly inspected. Mechanics found no electrical faults, no issues with the clock's internal mechanism, nothing that could explain the time drift. The incident was filed under unexplained phenomena in my patrol notes, a brief entry in a thick logbook. The dash clock has worked perfectly ever since that night. I never experienced anything like it again. The memory of that night, however, remains vivid. The cold, the isolation, the repeating voice on the radio, and the silent, impossible jumps of the clock. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm out on a night patrol, alone in the forest. The hum of the engine, the glow of the dash. I sometimes wonder if the time truly jumped, or if something else was happening in that quiet gap lot. I was the lead for a hasty search team, working a section of the Appalachian Trail. We were responding to a report of a missing hiker near a gap trailhead. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp, biting cold. Our handheld radios, usually reliable, were already showing an odd signal fluctuation. My role involved coordinating ground teams and maintaining communication with dispatch. We operated out of a small, prefabricated cabin not far from the highway, a temporary base camp for these kinds of incidents. The cabin was basic, just a few bunks, a map table, and our radio gear. Our primary communication was through a repeater located on a high ridge saddle, a few miles deeper into the forest. This repeater was essential for covering the rugged terrain where direct radio contact was often impossible. We had a standard operating procedure for every missing person case, a methodical approach that rarely deviated. Our teams were well-trained, experienced in navigating the dense Appalachian woods, even in challenging conditions. The routine was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. We checked equipment, reviewed maps, and confirmed radio frequencies before every deployment. The hum of the base radio was a constant, reassuring presence in the cabin. That evening, a light fog had begun to settle, making the forest even more isolated. Our initial search teams had been out since mid-afternoon, covering the most likely trail sections. As night fell, the temperature dropped significantly, barely above freezing. I was monitoring the radio, listening for check-ins from the two teams on the ground. Each team carried a handheld radio, a GPS unit, and a small pack with emergency supplies. Their instructions were clear: maintain a steady pace, stick to the marked trail, and report any findings or anomalies immediately. The radio sheet detailed their call signs, frequencies, and scheduled check-in times. Everything seemed normal on paper, but the air felt different, heavier. Around a little past midnight, the first irregularity became more pronounced. Team Alpha, working a reroute section of the trail, attempted to check in. I heard the squelch click, a brief burst of static, then nothing. Their signal strength indicator on my base radio showed a full 5 bars, but no audio followed. I tried to call them back, but received only silence. A few minutes later, Team Bravo, positioned closer to the ridge saddle, reported the same issue. They could see their radio indicating a strong signal, but their transmissions were not going through. They also reported hearing what sounded like a phantom keying on the repeater input, a brief, silent carrier wave, but with no voice. This was highly unusual. I instructed both teams to attempt a direct radio check with each other, bypassing the repeater. They confirmed they could not hear each other, despite being within what should have been direct line of sight range. Their handhelds showed full battery life, yet they passed no carrier. This suggested an issue with the repeater itself, or something interfering with the signal path. I logged these observations in the incident report, noting the precise times of each failed transmission. The cold outside seemed to seep into the cabin, despite the small heater running. The silence from the radios was unnerving, a stark contrast to the usual chatter. I made the decision to send a small technical team to the repeater hut on the ridge saddle. This team consisted of myself and one other technician, Mark. We packed a separate radio, a diagnostic kit, and extra batteries. The drive up the gravel access road was slow, our headlights cutting through the thickening fog. The forest pressed in on both sides, dark and silent. The air grew colder as we ascended. We reached the repeater hut after about an hour, a small, windowless structure made of corrugated metal. A faint hum emanated from inside, the sound of the equipment running. The hut was secured with a heavy padlock. I unlocked it, the metal groaning in the cold. Inside, the air was stale and cool. The equipment rack stood against one wall, a series of blinking lights indicating its operational status. The main repeater unit had a small LED that normally blinked with every incoming transmission. We observed it closely. Every minute, precisely at the 12-second mark, the LED would flash once. It was a single, brief blink, consistent and rhythmic. This indicated that the repeater was receiving an input signal. However, there was no corresponding audio output, and no indication of a carrier being retransmitted. Mark checked the repeater's internal log. It confirmed an incoming carrier at the 12-second mark of every minute, but no audio data was registered. It was as if a radio was keying up, but transmitting absolute silence. We checked the power supply, the antenna connections, and the internal diagnostics. Everything appeared normal. The equipment was functioning as designed, yet it was processing a silent, phantom signal. We tried transmitting from our own handhelds directly into the repeater from inside the hut. Our transmissions registered on the LED and in the log, and our voices were clearly retransmitted. This confirmed the repeater itself was operational. The problem was external, originating from somewhere in the field. I contacted dispatch via satellite phone, reporting the strange anomaly. They confirmed no other teams were operating in the area, and no known interference sources were present. The regular, silent keying continued, a steady, unsettling rhythm in the quiet hut. It felt like a presence, a constant, unheard whisper on the airwaves. We spent another hour running diagnostics, but found nothing. The repeater was receiving a signal that shouldn't exist, a signal that was effectively jamming our field teams. I made the call to pull both ground teams back to the base cabin. Their safety was paramount, and operating without reliable communication was too great a risk. It took them a few hours to navigate back through the cold, dark forest. When they arrived, they were visibly shaken, not just from the cold, but from the isolation and the radio silence. They described the feeling of being cut off, the constant, silent keying on their handhelds, a reminder that something was trying to communicate, or perhaps just occupy the airwaves, without success. One of the team members mentioned hearing a faint, almost imperceptible static burst just before the silent keying, like a breath being taken. We filed a comprehensive report with local law enforcement and the Regional Park Service. The repeater log, showing the phantom keying, was included as evidence. Technicians from the State Communications Department later investigated the site. They found no physical evidence of tampering, no rogue transmitters, and no environmental factors that could explain the consistent, silent carrier wave. The phenomenon eventually ceased after about 3 days, as abruptly as it began. The repeater returned to normal operation, and our communications were restored. The missing hiker was eventually located, disoriented but unharmed, having simply wandered off the trail. The incident was officially logged as an unexplained radio anomaly. There was no logical explanation for the consistent, silent keying of the repeater. The file remains open, a curious entry in the logbook of our operations. I still think about that rhythmic blink, the silent carrier. and the feeling of isolation it created. It was a sound that wasn't a sound, a presence that wasn't a presence, a constant whisper on the airwaves. I still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments, a brief, silent click in the back of my mind. I was a ridge runner for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp, biting cold. My routine check of the shelter logbook revealed an unusual entry. My job involved regular patrols of a specific section of the Appalachian Trail, maintaining shelters, clearing minor obstructions, and checking on hikers. This particular stretch wound through a remote part of the mountains, known for its sudden weather shifts and deep isolation. The shelter in question was a standard three-sided lean-to, built with a sturdy tin roof and a wooden sleeping platform. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, about 3 miles from the nearest access road. I had installed a small, low-profile trail camera inside the shelter a few weeks prior, aimed at the ladder leading to the sleeping platform. This was part of a pilot program to monitor shelter usage and deter vandalism. The camera was motion-activated and recorded short video clips, storing them on an internal card. I usually checked it once every 2 weeks, downloading the footage to my tablet. The logbook entry was from a solo hiker, dated a few nights before, simply stating, "Heard something on the roof, no tracks." This was the first time I had seen such a note. My routine began early, usually before dawn, with a drive along a winding gravel road to a trailhead. From there, I would hike the trail, checking each shelter and campsite. The air was always crisp, often carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I carried a pack with tools, a first aid kit, and a two-way radio for dispatch contact, though signal was often spotty in the deeper valleys. The trail itself was well marked, but could be challenging, especially after a frost or a light dusting of snow. I knew every bend, every rock formation, every stream crossing. My work was methodical, a rhythm of walking, observing, and recording. I would sweep out the shelters, replenish toilet paper, and make notes in my own logbook about trail conditions or any issues. The solitude was usually a comfort, a quiet hum in the background of my thoughts. This particular morning, the sky was a pale gray, promising more cold. A thin layer of powder snow had fallen overnight, barely covering the ground and the shelter roof. I reached the shelter around mid-morning. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of dry leaves. The powder snow lay undisturbed across the clearing, a smooth, unbroken white blanket. I approached the shelter cautiously, my boots crunching softly on the frozen earth. The logbook entry from a few days prior still lingered in my mind. I checked the exterior first. The tin roof was covered in a pristine layer of fresh snow, perfectly smooth, like glass. There were no footprints, no indentations, nothing to suggest anything had been on it. I walked around the entire structure, examining the ground, the surrounding trees, and the roofline from every angle. The snow was too light to hold a deep impression, but even a slight disturbance would have been visible. There was nothing. I stepped inside the shelter, the air immediately feeling colder than outside. The interior was tidy, no signs of recent occupation. I retrieved the trail camera from its hidden perch. I connected the camera to my tablet and began reviewing the footage. Most clips showed squirrels, birds, or the occasional deer passing through the shelter opening. There were also a few clips of hikers entering or leaving. I fast-forwarded through the uneventful segments. Then I found the night of the logbook entry. The video was dark, grainy, illuminated only by the camera's infrared light. The timestamp indicated it was well past midnight. The shelter was empty, The sound of the forest was faint, a low, continuous whisper of wind through the trees. Suddenly, a distinct sound cut through the quiet. It was a metallic ping, clear and resonant, as if something heavy had been dropped onto the tin roof directly above the camera. The sound was not muffled by snow, it was sharp and precise. I replayed the clip several times, isolating the sound. It was a single, weighted impact, followed by a faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound, like something being dragged slowly across the surface. The scraping lasted only a few seconds, then silence returned. The camera continued to record the empty shelter for another minute before the motion sensor timed out. I checked the subsequent clips. Nothing. The next activity was a hiker entering the shelter the following morning, the same person who had left the logbook entry. I reviewed the footage from the night before the incident. It was uneventful. The night of the incident, the camera had only triggered once for that single sound. I felt a prickle of unease. The sound was undeniable, yet the physical evidence of tracks was completely absent. I spent the rest of the day meticulously examining the shelter and its surroundings. I climbed onto the roof, carefully brushing away the powder snow. The tin was smooth, with no dents, no scratches, no signs of impact. I checked the eaves, the support beams, and the surrounding trees for any indication of an animal or object that could have caused the sound. There were no broken branches, no disturbed snow on any nearby tree limbs that might have dropped something onto the roof. The snow on the roof was uniformly thin, barely a quarter-inch deep. It was too light to have cushioned any impact, yet too light to have been disturbed without leaving a mark. I took numerous photographs of the roof, the snow, and the surrounding area, documenting the pristine conditions. The cold air bit at my exposed skin. I then focused on the interior. The camera had been positioned low, near the floor, aimed at the ladder. I re-watched the video, paying close attention to the bottom of the frame. Just as the metallic ping occurred, a dark, indistinct shape briefly entered the very bottom edge of the frame. It was too blurry to identify clearly, but it looked like the edge of a glove or a dark piece of fabric brushing against the lowest rung of the ladder. It was there for less than a second, then gone. The camera's infrared light was not strong enough to illuminate it properly. I tried to recreate the angle, positioning my own hand with a glove near the ladder rung. It was difficult to get it to appear so fleetingly and indistinctly. The implication was unsettling. Someone or something was inside the shelter, or at least very close to the camera, at the exact moment the sound occurred on the roof. Yet the shelter appeared empty in the footage. I hiked back to my truck, the tablet with the footage secured in my pack. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the forest. The isolation of the trail felt different now, less comforting, more oppressive. I drove to the nearest town, where I could get a reliable radio signal. I contacted dispatch and filed a detailed report, including my observations, the photographs, and the video clips. I emphasized the lack of physical evidence on the roof, despite the clear audio recording and the brief, unidentifiable shape in the camera frame. The dispatcher listened patiently, noting down the details. They said they would pass it up the chain, likely to the park rangers or local law enforcement. I knew it was an unusual report, one that would likely be met with skepticism. The next few days, I continued my regular patrols, but my focus had shifted. I checked the shelter more frequently, always hoping to find some new piece of evidence, some logical explanation. I found nothing. The snow eventually melted. Then another light snowfall covered the ground again. Each time, the roof remained undisturbed. The park rangers did follow up, sending a team to inspect the shelter. They found nothing conclusive. Their official report noted unexplained auditory event and insufficient evidence to determine cause. The brief, blurry image in the camera frame was dismissed as a possible artifact, or an animal moving quickly out of frame. The logbook entry from the hiker was considered anecdotal. The incident was filed away. I still work as a ridge runner. I still patrol that section of the trail. I still check that shelter. Every time I approach it, especially on a cold, clear night, I find myself listening. I listen for any sound that doesn't belong, any whisper in the forest that seems too close. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, or when the silence is too deep, I can almost hear it again. That single weighted ping on the tin roof, followed by the faint, slow scrape. I know what the official report says, but I also know what I heard, and what I saw, or almost saw, in the camera's dim light. The memory of that sound, and the complete absence of any explanation, stays with me. It's a quiet dread that settles in the back of my mind, a reminder of the things that can happen out there, things that leave no tracks. I was on my routine night patrol. It was a clear, cold autumn evening in the Appalachians. A distant, faint light appeared where no trail should have been. My job involved monitoring a specific section of the Appalachian Trail, particularly around the gap trailheads and ridge saddles. I was a night patroller, responsible for checking shelters, ensuring compliance with regulations, and reporting any unusual activity. This particular stretch was known for its isolation, a place where the forest pressed close to the narrow gravel access roads. The air was sharp, barely above freezing, and the ground was firm with a light frost. I had just completed a sweep of the Birch Gap shelter, noting the logbook was current, and was heading back towards my vehicle. My headlights cut through the deep night, illuminating the dense tree line. The hum of the engine was the only sound for miles. My routine was precise, almost ritualistic. I would drive slowly, scanning the trailheads and any visible sections of the path with my powerful spotlight. I carried a printed map, a radio, and a pair of binoculars. The radio was often unreliable in these deep valleys, prone to static, but it was my only link to dispatch. I knew every curve of the road, every rise and fall of the terrain. The trail system itself was well documented, with every spur and reroute clearly marked, even those that had been officially closed. This knowledge formed the bedrock of my patrols, a constant reference against the unpredictable wilderness. The isolation was a familiar companion, a quiet presence that defined the night. I was about 3 miles from the Birch Gap trailhead, on a winding section of the access road that ran parallel to a steep ridge. My vehicle was moving slowly, perhaps 15 miles an hour. The forest on my left rose sharply, a dark wall against the faint starlight. That is when I saw it. A single point of light, high up on the ridge. It was a headlamp, distinct and steady. My first thought was a lost hiker, but the location was wrong. This light was moving on what I knew to be a closed reroute, a section of trail that had been decommissioned years ago due to erosion. It was steep, overgrown, and officially impassable. I pulled the vehicle to the side of the road, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the distant whisper of the wind through the pines. I grabbed my binoculars. The headlamp was still there, a small, focused beam. It was moving uphill, against the natural grade of the terrain. This was immediately unsettling. No one would attempt that reroute at night, especially not alone. The trail was barely visible even in daylight, choked with laurel and fallen timber. The light seemed to float, not bobbing with the gait of a person walking. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, a steady ascent. I watched for a few minutes, my breath misting in the cold air. The light continued its slow, deliberate climb. It was not a vehicle, nor was it an animal. The beam was too focused, too consistent. It seemed to be moving at a pace faster than a person could manage on such a steep, broken path. There was no sound, no crunch of boots on leaves, no rustle of clothing against brush. Just the silent, ascending light. It reached a point where the dense laurel thicket closed in, forming a solid wall of vegetation. I expected it to pause, or to change direction, perhaps to find a way around the obstruction. Instead, it simply continued, moving directly into the thicket. The light did not dim, nor did it waver. It just entered the dense foliage and vanished. One moment it was there, a clear point of illumination, and the next it was gone, as if absorbed by the forest itself. I lowered the binoculars, the cold metal pressing against my face. The spot where the light had disappeared was now just a darker patch in the already black forest. I waited, scanning the area, but nothing reappeared. The silence returned, heavier now, more absolute. I checked my printed map again, unfolding it under the dim dome light of my vehicle. The closed reroute was clearly marked, a dashed line veering off the main trail. There were no spurs, no side paths, no shelters or any other features indicated in that specific area. The map confirmed what I already knew. There was no reason for anyone to be there, and certainly no way for a light to simply disappear into solid laurel. I picked up my radio, attempting to contact dispatch. I pressed the transmit button, but all I heard was static, a low, persistent hum that filled the cabin. I tried several times, adjusting the antenna, but the signal remained dead. This was not uncommon in the deeper parts of the valley, but it felt particularly inconvenient at that moment. I considered my options. My protocol dictated reporting unusual activity. With the radio out, a direct investigation was the next step, but caution was paramount. I was alone, miles from any other human presence. I decided to approach the area on foot, but not directly up the reroute. I would follow the access road a little further, to where the main trail intersected it, and then hike in from a more established point. I grabbed my own headlamp, a powerful beam, and my heavy-duty flashlight. The air felt sharper now, the cold more biting. I locked the vehicle and began walking, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. The forest felt different, more watchful. Every shadow seemed deeper, every rustle of leaves more pronounced. I kept my own headlamp off for a time, relying on the faint starlight, trying to maintain my night vision and listen. I walked for about 20 minutes, reaching the main trail intersection. From there, I turned onto the path, moving slowly and deliberately. The trail was well maintained here, but the darkness was absolute beneath the canopy. I used my flashlight sparingly, sweeping the beam ahead of me. I was looking for any sign of recent passage, a broken branch, a fresh footprint, anything that would indicate someone had been on the closed reroute. I reached the point where the reroute branched off the main trail. It was marked by a faded, weathered sign indicating its closure. The path was indeed overgrown, a narrow tunnel of dense vegetation. I stood at the entrance to the closed reroute, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam struggled to penetrate the thick laurel. There was no discernible path, just a wall of tangled branches and leaves. I listened intently. There was no sound of movement, no distant whisper, nothing but the natural sounds of the forest. I walked a short distance into the reroute, pushing aside branches, feeling the rough texture of the leaves against my jacket. The ground was soft with leaf litter, but I saw no fresh tracks. No evidence of anyone having recently passed through. It was as if the light had simply dissolved into the landscape. I spent another hour meticulously searching the immediate area, both on the main trail and along the perimeter of the closed reroute. I took several photographs of the dense laurel thicket where the light had vanished, though I knew they would show nothing but darkness. I checked for any discarded gear, any disturbed ground, any sign at all. There was nothing. The area was pristine, untouched. The cold began to seep into my bones, a persistent chill that went beyond the temperature. I eventually returned to my vehicle, the radio still emitting a low, static hum. I drove back to the nearest ranger station, a small cabin about an hour away, to file my report. My official report detailed the sighting of an unexplained light source on a closed trail section. I included the exact location, the time of observation, and the peculiar nature of its movement and disappearance. I noted the radio blackout and the lack of any physical evidence upon investigation. The incident was logged, a brief entry in the patrol logbook. There was no follow-up investigation beyond my own initial search. No missing persons report matched the description of the event. The file remained open, but inactive. The authorities had no explanation, and neither did I. The memory of that night remains clear. I still patrol that section of the trail, and sometimes, in the deep isolation of the night, I find myself scanning the ridge where the laurel closes. I listen for a distant crunch, or watch for a faint ascending light. It never reappears. I am a trail maintainer for a section of the Appalachian Trail. I was performing a routine shelter inspection on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. I noticed an anomaly in the shelter's register logbook. My work involves regular patrols of a specific trail segment. This includes clearing fallen trees, marking faded blazes, and checking on the condition of the shelters. Each shelter contains a logbook, a simple bound ledger where hikers record their names, dates, and brief notes. These logs serve as a loose record of trail traffic and sometimes contain vital information for search and rescue operations. I had been maintaining this particular section for several years. I knew the rhythm of the trail, the usual patterns of hikers, and the subtle changes that marked the seasons. The isolation of the work was a constant companion, a quiet hum in the background of the forest. I often spent days alone, sometimes seeing no one but a few passing hikers. The logbooks were a small connection to the human world, a way to feel the pulse of the trail community. They were also a critical tool for my job, providing a rough timeline of who had passed through. On this specific day, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. A thin layer of frost still clung to the shaded rocks. I arrived at the shelter just as dusk began to settle. The air was barely above freezing. I lit my small propane lantern, its soft hiss filling the small cabin, pushing back the encroaching darkness. I pulled the logbook from its cubby beneath the rough-hewn table. It was a standard-issue, green-covered ledger, its pages filled with various handwritings. I flipped through the recent entries, noting a few familiar names and some new ones. Then I stopped on an entry from a few nights prior. It was dated, but not with a specific time. The name was J. Miller. The entry was brief, just a name and a note about the cold night. I remembered this name. A few days earlier, a dispatch report had mentioned a hiker named J. Miller being evacuated from a trail section in an adjacent county. The report had specified a leg injury and a helicopter extraction. This shelter was many miles from that reported location, a journey that would take a fit hiker at least a full day, possibly longer, even without an injury. I paused, my thumb resting on the page. The initial entry for J. Miller was clear, written in a dark blue ink, a common ballpoint pen.
It simply stated,
J. Miller, cold night. Below this, however, were additional lines. They were clearly added later, but in the same distinct handwriting and the exact same shade of blue ink. The new lines continued the narrative, describing events that would have occurred after the reported evacuation. Heard something outside, one line read. Sounded like a whisper in the fog. Another line followed. Felt a cold draft. Door was shut tight. The entries continued, detailing a growing sense of unease. Lantern flickered, then went out. It read. Felt a presence just outside the cabin. The final line was the most unsettling. Left a message, but no one came. The ink appeared to be identical to the first entry, as if the pen had never left the page or had been picked up again by the same hand. The paper showed no signs of smudging or pressure differences. It was as if the original entry had simply expanded, growing organically on the page. I leaned closer, holding the lantern to illuminate the page more clearly. The pencil drag of the original entry and the subsequent additions showed no variation in pressure. It was a consistent, deliberate hand. My mind raced, trying to reconcile the logbook entry with the official report. An evacuated hiker could not have been here, writing in this logbook, days after their extraction. The distance alone made it impossible, let alone the injury. I took out my phone and began to photograph the page. I captured several images, focusing on the ink, the handwriting, and the surrounding entries. The light from my phone screen was stark against the warm glow of the lantern. A sudden gust of wind rattled the shelter door, sending a shiver through me. The forest outside was a wall of blackness, the only sound the rustling of dry leaves and the distant hum of the wind through the ridge saddles. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps another J. Miller? But the evacuation report had been quite specific, including a physical description that matched a hiker I had seen on the trail a few weeks prior. The odds of two hikers with the same name, on the same trail, experiencing such a coincidence seemed incredibly remote. I checked the dates of the surrounding entries. The original J. Miller entry was dated 2 nights ago. The evacuation report had come in 3 nights ago, from a trailhead about 50 miles south. The timeline simply did not fit. The new lines in the logbook described a night of increasing dread, culminating in the feeling of being abandoned. It was a chilling account, made more so by the knowledge that the person who supposedly wrote it was not supposed to be there. The air in the cabin felt colder, despite the lantern. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, a familiar sensation of isolation deepening into something more unsettling. I spent the next hour reviewing the logbook, comparing the handwriting to other entries, looking for any sign of a hoax or a prank. There was none. The handwriting was consistent, the ink uniform. I felt a growing sense of unease, a quiet dread that settled deep in my chest. I packed my gear, extinguishing the lantern and plunging the cabin into darkness. The trail back to my truck was about 3 miles, a familiar path I had walked countless times. Tonight, however, the forest felt different. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth seemed amplified. The isolation, usually a comfort, now felt like a vulnerability. I walked quickly, my headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the dense woods. The sounds of the night seemed to press in from all sides. I kept replaying the words from the logbook in my mind, particularly the line about the whisper in the fog. The next morning, I drove to the nearest ranger station. I presented my photographs and explained the situation to the district supervisor. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He pulled up the official evacuation report for J. Miller. The details matched my recollection. A hiker with a leg injury, extracted by helicopter from a gap trailhead in the next county, 3 days prior to the logbook entry. The report was clear, time-stamped, and confirmed. He looked at my photographs of the logbook with a frown. "This is unusual," he stated, his voice flat. He made a few calls to dispatch, confirming the details of the evacuation. There was no ambiguity. Jay Miller was not supposed to have been at that shelter. He was not supposed to have been anywhere on the trail. The supervisor filed a report, attaching my photographs as evidence. He mentioned the possibility of a prank, but the details of the handwriting and ink, the way the entry seemed to have grown, made that explanation feel inadequate. He suggested that perhaps another hiker had added to the entry, attempting to be humorous. But the handwriting was too consistent, too precise. The report was logged, becoming another piece of paper in a file. No further investigation was deemed necessary. There was no crime, no missing person, just an inexplicable entry in a remote shelter logbook. The incident was closed, at least officially. I returned to my duties, but the image of those expanding lines in the logbook remained with me. The quiet hum of the forest now carried a different resonance. The official report noted the discrepancy and filed it away. There was no resolution, no explanation that truly fit the facts. The logbook itself was eventually replaced during a subsequent maintenance cycle, its pages of unsettling entries now stored in an archive. I still think about that entry sometimes, the way the ink seemed to grow on the page, detailing a night that should never have happened. The memory of that cold cabin, the lantern's hiss, and the whisper in the fog still lingers. I was on a standard search and rescue patrol. It was late autumn, a cold, clear night in the Appalachian foothills. The air held a sharp, metallic scent, and the first anomaly appeared on the trail ahead. My partner, Miller, was a few paces in front of me, his headlamp beam cutting a precise tunnel through the deep forest. We were checking a section of the Appalachian Trail near a known reroute, following up on a report of an overdue solo hiker. The hiker's last known logbook entry was from a shelter about 10 miles north of our current position. Dispatch had lost radio contact with them nearly a full day prior. The night was still. The only sounds were our boots on the gravel path and the distant hum of the highway, a sound that faded quickly as we moved deeper into the woods. The temperature was dropping steadily, already barely above freezing. We had been moving for a few hours, covering ground efficiently. Our objective was a small, isolated cabin often used by through hikers, located near a creek crossing. This cabin was a common point for hikers to leave notes or resupply, a place where the missing person might have stopped. The forest around us was dense, the trees bare, their branches forming a skeletal canopy against the faint starlight. Our typical patrols involved checking trail conditions, verifying logbook entries, and occasionally assisting hikers with minor issues. We often worked at night, especially during colder months when daylight hours were short and the risks of exposure increased. The Appalachian Trail, even in well-traveled sections, could become disorienting quickly, particularly after dark or during unexpected weather shifts. We carried standard SAR gear, first aid, navigation tools, emergency shelters, and communication equipment. Our radio was usually reliable in this area, but the recent static and intermittent blackouts had been a concern. The creek crossing we were approaching was marked by an old, sturdy footbridge. It was a familiar landmark, a place where the trail dipped into a small hollow before climbing back up a ridge saddle. The water below was usually shallow and clear, but recent rains might have changed its character. We had a set of thermal viewers and a high-resolution DSLR camera with us, standard equipment for documenting trail conditions or potential evidence. Our procedure was always methodical, documenting everything, no matter how minor it seemed at the time. This approach had proven effective in previous incidents, helping us piece together events. The isolation of these trail sections, often meant that every detail mattered. We reached the footbridge a little past midnight. The air grew noticeably colder as we descended into the hollow. The creek below was wider than usual, its surface a dark, reflective sheet moving with a quiet hush. There was no wind down in the hollow, a stark contrast to the slight breeze we had felt on the ridge. The bridge itself was a simple wooden structure with a metal pipe handrail, slick with condensation. Miller's headlamp swept across the rail, then stopped. He indicated a spot with his headlamp beam. A thin layer of frost coated sections of the metal rail. This was not unusual for the temperature. What was unusual was its behavior. As I watched, a patch of frost, perhaps a few inches across, seemed to thicken, becoming opaque and white. Then, slowly, it began to recede, thinning out, almost vanishing, only to reform again a few seconds later. The cycle was steady, rhythmic, a consistent expansion and contraction of the frost. It was happening on multiple spots along the rail, each patch expanding and contracting independently, yet with a consistent, almost synchronized timing. I pulled out my thermal viewer. Through the lens, the rail showed a fluctuating temperature signature. The areas where the frost was forming registered a sudden drop in surface temperature, then a gradual rise as it cleared. The pattern was precise, repeating every few seconds. It was not a random atmospheric effect. The air temperature around the rail remained constant, barely above freezing. There was no visible source of heat or cold that would cause such a localized, rhythmic change. The creek water below was still, black, and silent, reflecting the faint starlight without a ripple. Miller took out the DSLR camera. He began taking a series of photographs, capturing the frost at various stages of its formation and recession. The micro ice crystals were visible in the camera's flash, appearing and disappearing with uncanny regularity. We checked the underside of the bridge, the wooden planks, the surrounding trees. There was nothing. No animal, no hidden vent, no unusual geological feature. The phenomenon was confined solely to the metal handrail, specifically to the upper surface, where condensation would naturally collect. We spent a good half hour observing it. The rhythm never faltered. It was too regular to be natural, too localized to be environmental. The silence of the hollow amplified the strangeness. The water's hush seemed to absorb all other sounds, leaving only the visual expansion and contraction of the frost. We tried touching the rail. It felt cold, then slightly less cold, then cold again, mirroring the visual changes. There was no vibration, no discernible energy transfer. It was a purely thermal and visual event. The implications were unsettling. Something was causing these precise, rhythmic temperature fluctuations, but there was no explanation. The phenomenon was a precise, rhythmic temperature fluctuation, an invisible process making itself known through the formation and clearing of ice. We documented the incident thoroughly, taking dozens of photographs and detailed field notes. The thermal images provided clear evidence of the temperature shifts. We recorded the ambient air temperature, the water temperature, and the general weather conditions. Our report would need to be comprehensive. We tried to contact dispatch again, but our radio remained silent, filled only with static. The blackout was complete in this hollow, which was unusual even for a remote section of the trail. This added another layer of isolation to the experience. We decided to proceed to the cabin, maintaining our patrol objective. The rhythmic frost continued on the bridge rail as we left, a silent, pulsing anomaly in the dark. The trail beyond the bridge climbed steeply, and the air grew slightly warmer as we gained elevation. The forest felt different now, heavier, more watchful. We reached the cabin about an hour later. It was empty. The logbook inside contained no new entries since the one we already knew about. There were no signs of the missing hiker, no gear, no recent activity. The cabin was cold and still, a small, dark space in the vast forest. We conducted a perimeter search around the cabin, checking for any tracks or discarded items. There was nothing. The ground was too frozen and covered with leaf litter to show clear prints. We then began a wider search pattern, moving along the trail in both directions from the cabin for about a mile. The radio remained dead. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of our boots and the occasional whisper of the wind through the bare branches. The sense of isolation deepened with every step. We returned to the footbridge before dawn, hoping to observe the frost phenomenon again in different light conditions. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky, casting a pale gray light through the trees. The air was still bitterly cold. As we approached the bridge, we saw it again. The rhythmic frost was still there, though perhaps less pronounced in the faint light. It continued its steady expansion and contraction, forming and clearing on the metal rail. We took more photographs, trying to capture the subtle changes as the light increased. The creek below still ran black, its surface undisturbed. The phenomenon persisted until the sun finally cleared the ridge and direct light hit the bridge, at which point the frost vanished entirely, leaving only condensation. We spent the remaining daylight hours expanding our search for the missing hiker, covering several miles of trail and checking nearby reroutes and ridge saddles. We found no trace. The radio remained unresponsive. We eventually had to hike out to a higher elevation, about 3 miles from the bridge, before we could re-establish contact with dispatch. The report of the rhythmic frost was met with silence, then a request for a detailed file and all photographic evidence. Our official report detailed the search efforts, the lack of any sign of the missing hiker, and the unusual frost phenomenon. The photographs and thermal images of the rhythmic frost were submitted as evidence. The incident was logged, and the file was marked as unexplained environmental anomaly. There was no scientific explanation offered for the rhythmic temperature fluctuations. Subsequent visits to the footbridge by other SAR teams under similar weather conditions never replicated the event. The missing hiker was never found. Their logbook entry remained the last confirmed sighting. The RCMP reviewed our findings, but without further evidence or a clear cause, the frost incident remained an isolated, unexplainable observation. It became a footnote in the larger file of the missing person case. The trail section was re-patrolled extensively, but nothing else out of the ordinary was ever reported. The creek continued to flow, the bridge remained, and the forest held its secrets. The isolation of that night, compounded by the radio blackout, left a lasting impression. I still think about that footbridge sometimes. The way the frost formed and cleared, so steady, so deliberate. It was a rhythmic expansion and contraction on the metal. The silence of the hollow, the black water below, and that rhythmic change. It all combined into a memory that doesn't fade. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated strangeness, a quiet dread that settled deep. I hear the waters hush in my mind, and I see the micro-ice forming and then gone. I was a volunteer trail maintainer for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp chill, barely above freezing. I noticed a small, unexpected detail at the reroute junction. My duties involved regular patrols of a specific section of the Appalachian Trail. This included checking shelters, clearing minor obstructions, and updating notices at trailheads and junctions. The work was solitary, often spanning several days in the deep forest. I carried a pack with essential gear, a paper map, and a satellite communication device for emergencies. My routine was well established, a rhythm of hiking, observation, and meticulous record-keeping. I found a quiet satisfaction in the procedural nature of the task. The isolation was a known factor, a constant companion on the ridge saddles and through the gap trailheads. This particular patrol was scheduled for a stretch known for its dense canopy and infrequent hiker traffic. The weather had been clear, but a persistent fog often settled in the valleys by nightfall. The junction kiosk was a simple wooden structure, weathered by years of sun and rain. It stood at a point where a temporary reroute diverged from the main trail, marked by a bright orange notice. This notice, a standard laminated sheet, was stapled securely to the kiosk's backboard. I had posted it myself a few weeks prior, ensuring each corner was fastened tightly. My job that day was to confirm the reroute was still clearly marked and that no new hazards had emerged. The forest was quiet, the kind of deep silence that absorbs all sound. There was no wind, not even a whisper through the bare branches. The air was still and cold, holding the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. I approached the kiosk, my boots crunching softly on the gravel path. I reached the kiosk and began my visual inspection. The orange notice was still there, but something about it seemed off. One of the top corners, previously stapled flat, was now slightly raised. It was barely perceptible, perhaps a millimeter or two, but it caught my eye. I leaned closer, examining the staple. It appeared intact, still holding the laminated sheet to the wood. I reached out, intending to press the corner back down to ensure it was flush. As my fingers neared the paper, the raised corner lifted further, then snapped back into place. It made a distinct, sharp click. The sound was clear, like a small counter being pressed, or a single key on an old typewriter. I froze, my hand still hovering in the air. The click was undeniable. It was a mechanical sound, not organic. I looked around, scanning the immediate area. The forest remained utterly still. No breeze stirred the leaves on the ground, no branches swayed overhead. The air was perfectly calm. I checked my own clothing, my pack straps, anything that might have brushed against the kiosk or created a sudden draft. Nothing. I stood there for a few moments, listening, waiting for another sound, for an explanation. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. It was a deep, unbroken quiet that seemed to press in from all sides. I lowered my hand slowly. My mind searched for a rational cause. Perhaps a residual tension in the laminated sheet, released by the cold? Or a subtle shift in the wood itself? I examined the notice again. The corner was now flat, as if it had never moved. I pressed on it gently with my thumb. It felt solid, firmly attached. I tried to replicate the movement, to see if I could make it click again. I pressed, I pulled, I wiggled the corner. Nothing. It remained stubbornly in place. The single sharp click seemed to have been an isolated event, a singular anomaly in the profound stillness of the forest. I pulled out my phone, switching it to camera mode. I took a photograph of the notice, focusing on the stapled corner. The image showed nothing unusual, just a laminated sheet on a wooden board. Then I switched to the voice memo recorder. I held the phone near the kiosk, speaking softly into the microphone. I described the exact time, the location, the complete lack of wind, and the sound I had heard. I detailed the raised corner, the click, and my inability to reproduce it. My voice was steady, procedural as always. I documented the observation as a minor irregularity, something to be noted in my logbook. I spent another few minutes at the junction, checking the reroute markers. Everything else was in order. The trail ahead was clear, the blazes visible. As I turned to continue my patrol, I glanced back at the kiosk. The orange notice was still there, flat and unmoving. The incident lingered in my mind, an unresolved detail. It was a small thing, a single click, but it felt out of place, an unnatural sound in a natural environment. The quiet dread it instilled was subtle, a faint hum beneath the surface of my calm, procedural approach. I continued my hike, but the forest felt different now, the silence more watchful. My next stop was a small, three-sided shelter about 3 miles further along the trail. I planned to spend the night there. The sun was beginning to dip below the ridge, casting long shadows through the trees. The air grew colder, and a thin fog began to drift up from the lower elevations. I reached the shelter just as the last light faded. I checked the logbook, a standard procedure. It was kept in a waterproof box inside the shelter. I opened it, expecting to see entries from hikers who had passed through recently. The last entry was dated nearly a week ago. This was unusual. This section of the trail, while not heavily trafficked, usually saw at least a few entries every couple of days. I flipped through the pages, going back several weeks. There were no missing pages, no signs of tampering, just a sudden, unexplained gap in the entries. It was another small irregularity, adding to the one at the kiosk. I made a note in my own field log, documenting the dates and the lack of recent activity. I tried my satellite communication device, attempting to send a routine check-in message to dispatch. The signal was weak, struggling to connect. I tried again, holding the device higher, moving to the edge of the shelter. Nothing. A faint static hum was all I received. The radio was blacked out. This was not entirely uncommon in deep valleys or certain ridge saddles, but it was inconvenient. I set up my sleeping bag, ate a cold meal, and settled in for the night. The cold seeped into the shelter, despite my layers. The fog outside thickened, obscuring the trees beyond a few feet. I lay awake for a long time, listening. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. My mind kept returning to the click at the kiosk, then to the empty logbook, then to the radio blackout. Each on its own was a minor event, easily dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern of absence and anomaly. I felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling that went beyond the usual solitude of the trail. The next morning, the fog was even denser. Visibility was poor, barely a few yards. The frost covered everything, turning the forest into a monochrome landscape. I packed up quickly, eager to reach a point where I might regain communication. I decided to retrace my steps to the reroute junction, to double-check the kiosk and the notice. The empty logbook and the radio silence had amplified the significance of that single click. I moved carefully through the fog, relying on my paper map and the faint blazes on the trees. The cold was penetrating, a constant presence. When I reached the kiosk, it was shrouded in a thick, damp fog. The orange notice was still there, still flat. I examined it closely, running my fingers over the laminated surface. It felt cold and smooth. I checked the staples again. They were firm. I took another photograph, hoping the fog might reveal something different in the light. It did not. I then tried to record another voice memo, but my phone's battery was unexpectedly low, despite being fully charged the previous evening. It died before I could finish. This was yet another small, inexplicable issue. I continued my patrol, eventually reaching a higher elevation where the fog began to thin. My satellite device finally connected, and I sent my delayed check-in message. I included a brief, factual report of the irregularities: the kiosk notice, the empty logbook, the radio blackout, and the phone battery drain. Dispatch acknowledged receipt, noting the unusual combination of events. They advised me to complete my patrol and file a full report upon my return. The rest of my patrol was uneventful, a return to the familiar rhythm of the trail. Upon my return, I filed a detailed report with the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. I included the photographs of the kiosk and the audio memo I had managed to record. The report was procedural, outlining the observations without speculation. The Conservancy reviewed the information. They sent out another volunteer to check the reroute junction and the shelter logbook. The follow-up report confirmed that the kiosk notice was secure, and the logbook remained without new entries for an extended period. No explanation was found for the click, the empty logbook, or the radio blackout. The incidents were logged as unexplained anomalies in the official file. I still volunteer on the trail, but that particular section holds a different weight for me now. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of the forest, I hear it again. That single, sharp click. It's a sound that seems to come from nowhere, a brief, mechanical punctuation in the vast silence. It reminds me of the things that exist just beyond our understanding, the small, unsettling details that defy explanation. I was monitoring a personal scanner in my truck, parked at a trailhead turnout. It was a cold, clear night in late autumn, the air barely above freezing. A faint, almost imperceptible hum began to bleed through the usual static. I am a dispatcher, and I have spent years listening to the radio. My shifts at the county office are long, often quiet, punctuated by the occasional call for a lost hiker or a minor road incident. On my nights off, I sometimes drive out to one of the Appalachian Trail gaps, finding a quiet spot to listen to the airwaves. It is a habit, a way to stay connected to the rhythm of the region, even when I am not on duty. The turnout at Black Bear Gap was a familiar place, a small gravel lot just off the highway, surrounded by dense forest. Headlights from passing vehicles were rare after midnight. The only consistent sound was the low idle of my truck's exhaust and the constant low hiss of the scanner. My setup was simple: a portable scanner connected to a small external antenna, powered by the truck's auxiliary port. I had a few frequencies programmed, mostly local emergency channels, but also some older, retired frequencies that sometimes picked up atmospheric anomalies or distant, faint signals. It was mostly for curiosity, a way to pass the time. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. A thin layer of frost had begun to form on the windshield. I had a thermos of coffee, and the cabin of the truck was warm. This particular night had been uneventful, just the usual crackle and pop, the distant chatter of a state trooper on patrol, or the occasional burst of garbled data. The isolation out here was profound, a deep quiet that city dwellers rarely experienced. It was the kind of night where you could almost hear the forest breathing. Then the hum intensified, a low, steady tone beneath the static. It was not a typical radio hum, which usually indicated interference or a weak signal. This felt different, more deliberate, almost like a carrier wave without a transmission. I adjusted the squelch, trying to filter it out, but it persisted. I checked the frequency display. It was on one of the retired channels, a frequency that had been decommissioned years ago, no longer allocated for active use. I had never heard anything on it before, not even phantom signals. I leaned forward, my hand resting on the scanner's tuning knob. The hum was steady, unwavering. It felt like waiting for something. A voice broke through the hum. It was faint, distorted by static, but clear enough to make out a single word, repeated. "Mayday." The voice was high-pitched, almost a whisper, but with an underlying urgency. It was a young voice, perhaps a teenager or a young adult. I immediately reached for my duty phone, then hesitated. This was a retired frequency. Reporting it would be complicated, likely dismissed as a phantom signal or a prank. Still, the word Mayday carried weight. I grabbed my personal phone instead, opened the voice recorder app, and held it near the scanner's speaker. The voice repeated the word, "Mayday," 3 times, then faded back into the hum and static. I listened intently, waiting for more, but there was nothing, just the persistent hum. I rewound the recording on my phone. The voice was undeniably there, thin and strained. I considered calling it in, but without a clear location or any further information, it would be a dead end. I decided to wait, to see if it returned. The silence stretched, broken only by the hum. About 10 minutes later, it happened again. The hum intensified slightly, then the voice returned. "Mayday." This time, it was different. The pitch was lower, the timbre rougher, clearly an adult male. The urgency was still there, but the voice itself was distinct from the first. I felt a prickle of unease. I had not stopped recording on my personal phone, but I quickly grabbed my work phone, opened its recorder, and held it next to the scanner as well. Both phones were now recording simultaneously. The male voice repeated "Mayday" twice, then again, the transmission cutting off abruptly. I stopped both recordings. My hands felt cold, despite the warmth of the truck cabin. I played back the first recording from my personal phone, the high-pitched, younger voice. Then I played the second recording from my work phone, captured at the exact same time as the first, the lower, rougher male voice. I played them side by side, alternating between the two. There was no doubt. 2 distinct voices, both saying "Mayday," both captured from the same scanner, on the same frequency, at the same moment. The implication was unsettling. It defied the basic principles of radio transmission. A single frequency, a single signal, should produce a single voice. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a strange atmospheric skip, bouncing 2 different signals from 2 different sources onto the same frequency. But that seemed highly improbable, especially on a retired channel. The hum was still there, a low, steady presence. I checked my scanner settings, ensuring no dual receive or scan functions were active. It was locked onto that single, retired frequency. I drove a short distance down the highway, then turned around, hoping a change in my physical location might alter the reception. When I returned to the gap turnout, the hum was still there, unwavering. I decided to try a different approach. I pulled out my old handheld amateur radio, a device I rarely used, and tuned it to the same retired frequency. The hum was present there too, though slightly fainter. I set it to record, then waited. About 15 minutes passed. The air in the truck felt heavy. The fog had begun to roll in, a thin, wispy layer drifting across the highway, obscuring the distant forest line. Then, the voice returned. "Mayday." This time, it was a third voice, almost a whisper, gender indeterminate, barely audible above the static. It repeated the word once, then vanished. I checked both my phones and the handheld radio. All 3 had captured the transmission, and all 3, when played back, revealed a slightly different vocal timbre, a subtle shift in pitch or resonance, even though the word was identical. It was as if the signal itself was fracturing, or reflecting multiple sources. I spent the next few hours at the Gap, recording every instance of the Mayday call. They came intermittently, sometimes 10 minutes apart, sometimes 30. Each time the voice was subtly different, a new variation on the same urgent plea. I had about a dozen recordings by the time dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky with a pale, cold light. The fog had thickened considerably, reducing visibility to a few car lengths. The hum on the scanner finally faded as the sun rose higher. I felt a deep weariness, not just from lack of sleep, but from the sheer strangeness of the experience. I drove back to the county office, the stack of audio files heavy on my mind. I knew reporting this would be difficult. I was a dispatcher, not a field agent. My role was to receive and relay information, not to investigate phantom radio signals. Still, the calls had been Maydays. I compiled a detailed report, outlining the exact frequencies, the times of reception, and the discrepancies in the recorded voices. I attached the audio files, carefully labeling them by device and time. My supervisor listened patiently, his expression unreadable. He acknowledged the oddity of the situation, but pointed out the lack of any actionable intelligence. No location, no specific distress, no active frequency. It was a ghost in the machine. The report was filed, categorized as an unexplained radio anomaly. There was no follow-up investigation. The official logbook entry was brief, a single line noting a possible phantom distress signal. I tried to forget about it, but the memory of those repeating, subtly shifting voices lingered. I occasionally tuned my personal scanner to that retired frequency, especially on cold, clear nights. The hum never returned, nor did the Mayday calls. The forest around Black Bear Gap remained quiet, its secrets held close. Sometimes, late at night, when the dispatch office is quiet and the only sound is the low hum of the equipment, I still hear it. Not with my ears, but in my mind. The whisper of a voice, repeating a single word, echoing from a place I cannot find. I was a crew chief for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, performing routine night assessments. It was late autumn, and the air held a sharp chill, barely above freezing. Our first pass through a ridge saddle revealed a small discrepancy in a mile marker. My team and I were responsible for maintaining sections of the Appalachian Trail, particularly the more remote stretches. This involved checking trail integrity, clearing minor obstructions, and verifying the accuracy of signage and mile markers. Night runs were common, allowing us to cover more ground when daylight hours were short, and to assess trail conditions under different light. We relied heavily on GPS units for precise location tracking and digital cameras for documentation. Our routine was methodical, almost ritualistic, ensuring every detail was logged and every anomaly reported. We knew these trails intimately, the way a sailor knows a familiar coastline. The forest at night, illuminated by our headlamps, became a tunnel of light and shadow, the familiar hum of our equipment a constant companion. We often worked in a quiet rhythm, the only sounds being our footsteps on the gravel and the distant whisper of the wind through the pines. On that particular night, we were working a section known for its unpredictable fog, a high ridge saddle that often collected moisture. The fog had begun to roll in as we ascended, creating a soft halo around our headlamps. Visibility dropped to a few yards, the cold air thick with moisture. We reached a specific mile marker, a standard painted aluminum plate affixed to a tree. It displayed a 3-digit number, indicating its distance from a known trailhead. I logged its position with the GPS and took a series of photographs, capturing the marker itself and its immediate surroundings. The digits were clear, painted in a standard font. We continued our sweep, moving further along the trail, checking other markers and logging conditions. The radio crackled with static, a common issue in the deeper valleys, but up on the ridge, we usually had better reception. Tonight, however, the static persisted, a low, constant hum that made communication difficult. After completing our assigned segment, we began our return journey, retracing our steps along the same path. The fog had intensified, now a dense, swirling mass that clung to the trees and obscured the trail ahead. The temperature had dropped further, and a thin layer of frost was beginning to form on the leaves. As we approached the same ridge saddle, I prepared to re-log the marker, a standard procedure for verification. My headlamp cut through the thick fog, its glare reflecting off the damp leaves. I located the marker, fixed to the same tree, in the exact spot our GPS had recorded earlier. But as I focused my light on the plate, I saw it. The 3 digits were reversed. The number I had logged and photographed just a few hours prior was now displayed in the opposite order. It was not a different marker. It was the same plate, the same tree, the same paint. The physical marker itself had not been moved or replaced. The digits had simply swapped positions. My first thought was exhaustion, a trick of the light, or perhaps the fog playing with my perception. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and re-aimed my headlamp. The digits remained reversed. I called over my team member, asking him to confirm what he saw. His voice was quiet, confirming the reversed sequence. We stood there for a few moments, the only sound the persistent radio static and the drip of moisture from the trees. I pulled out my camera and reviewed the earlier photographs. The original number was clear in the image. Then, I took new photographs of the reversed marker, ensuring the GPS data was embedded in the file. We checked our GPS unit. It confirmed we were standing at the exact same coordinates as our previous pass. The device showed a perfectly straight line on the track export, indicating no deviation in our path. Yet the physical marker had changed. The implications were unsettling. A mile marker is a fixed point, a constant reference. For its digits to reverse without any physical alteration defied logic. We tried to rationalize it. Had someone tampered with it in the short time we were away? But the paint looked undisturbed, the plate firmly attached. There were no footprints in the soft earth around the tree, no signs of recent human activity beyond our own. The isolation of the ridge saddle, especially in that dense fog, made the idea of a prank seem unlikely. We attempted to contact dispatch again, but the radio remained a wall of static. The hum was louder now, almost a low thrumming in the air. We were alone with this observation. We spent another hour at the site, meticulously documenting every detail. I took more photographs from different angles, trying to capture any subtle clue. We examined the paint, the texture of the tree bark, the ground around the marker. Everything appeared normal, except for the impossible reversal of the numbers. We rechecked our GPS tracks multiple times, comparing the coordinates of both passes. The device consistently showed the same location for both the original and the reversed marker. It was as if the trail itself had shifted, or perhaps our perception of it, while the GPS remained steadfastly anchored to an unchanging point in space. The cold began to seep deeper, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. We eventually left the saddle, the reversed marker a silent, inexplicable presence in the fog behind us. The rest of the night run was completed in a strained silence. The radio static continued, a constant reminder of our isolation. Back at the cabin, I immediately uploaded the GPS tracks and photographs. The evidence was clear. 2 sets of images taken at the same GPS coordinates showing 2 different yet numerically related mile marker readings. The track export showed a single, continuous path. I drafted a detailed report, outlining the incident with factual precision, avoiding any speculation. The team debated whether to trust the GPS track, which showed an unchanging location, or the physical paint on the marker, which had undeniably shifted. The report was filed with the regional office. It generated a considerable amount of discussion, but no definitive explanation. Some suggested a misreading, despite the photographic evidence. Others proposed a very elaborate, highly improbable prank. The marker was eventually removed from the trail, replaced with a new one a few weeks later. The original plate was never recovered or found. The incident became a footnote in the logbook, an unresolved anomaly. I still think about that night sometimes, the way the fog clung to the trees and the persistent hum of the radio static. The memory of those reversed digits, confirmed by 2 sets of photographs and yet contradicted by the unwavering GPS, remains. It was a quiet shift, a subtle alteration in a place that should have been fixed. I was a ridge runner for the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, responsible for a remote section of the trail. It was late autumn, just before dawn, and the air was barely above freezing inside the shelter. A faint metallic ping echoed from the roof, a sound I had heard before, but never quite like this. My routine involved long stretches of isolation, checking shelters, clearing minor trail obstructions, and logging hiker activity. This particular section of the Appalachian Trail was known for its quiet solitude, far from any major highway or town. I carried a radio, but reception was often spotty, especially deep in the forest or within certain ridge saddles. My small cabin, a few miles from the nearest gap trailhead, served as my base. I kept a detailed logbook, documenting everything from weather patterns to unusual observations. The work was procedural, demanding attention to detail and a calm demeanor, even when the night brought its own particular hum of the wilderness. The first time I heard the roof pings was about a month earlier, during a similar pre-dawn chill. It was a single, sharp tick, then silence. I dismissed it as a branch, or perhaps a small animal. This time, however, the sound was different. It began with that familiar metallic ping, a distinct sound against the corrugated aluminum roof. Then, after a pause of a few seconds, another ping, a little further along the roof line. It was a rhythmic progression, like something stepping carefully, moving from one end of the shelter to the other. The air inside the shelter was still, holding the sound without echo. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening intently, my breath held. The sequence repeated, a slow, deliberate traverse of the roof. There was no wind to explain it, no branches scraping. The sound stopped abruptly once it reached the far end, leaving only the quiet whisper of the forest outside. I waited for a long time, perhaps a full hour, but the sounds did not return. I made a brief note in my logbook, attributing it to an unknown animal, though the pattern felt too precise for a squirrel or raccoon. That night, the pings returned with an unnerving regularity. I had set up a small audio recorder near the shelter entrance, a standard practice for monitoring wildlife, but also a precaution after the previous incident. The temperature had dropped significantly, and a light frost covered the ground outside. I was awake well before the first hint of light, roused by the cold and a sense of anticipation. The first ping was sharp, almost directly above my sleeping area. It was followed by another, then another, moving steadily across the roof. Each sound was distinct, a clear metallic tick, not a scrape or a rustle. The pattern was identical to the previous time, a slow, measured progression. I could almost visualize whatever was up there, taking deliberate steps. The sounds were not heavy, suggesting something of moderate weight, but certainly not a bird. The sequence completed its traverse, paused for a moment, and then began again, moving back in the opposite direction. This second pass was slower, each ping more drawn out, as if whatever was moving was now more cautious. I could hear the faint creak of the metal as weight shifted. The isolation of the shelter amplified every sound, making it feel closer, more immediate. I remained still, listening, my hand resting on the small radio, though I knew it was unlikely to pick up anything in this specific hollow. The sounds continued for what felt like a long time, perhaps 20 minutes, before finally ceasing. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. I did not move until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees. As soon as there was enough light to see, I began my procedural check. I exited the shelter carefully, scanning the ground around the perimeter. A fresh, light dusting of snow had fallen during the night, enough to show clear impressions. I walked slowly, examining every inch of the ground leading up to the shelter walls. There were no footprints, human or animal, in the fresh snow. Not a single print leading to the roof line, nor any sign of a ladder or climbing aid. The only marks were faint scratches from birds, small and indistinct, nowhere near the size or pattern that would correspond to the sounds I had heard. I checked the rear of the shelter, where the roof sloped closest to the ground, but found nothing. The snow was undisturbed, a pristine white blanket. I took several photographs of the untouched snow, documenting the lack of evidence. My gaze swept the surrounding forest, but the trees stood silent and still, shrouded in a thin fog that was just beginning to lift. The cold air felt sharper now, carrying a different kind of weight. Back inside, I retrieved the audio recorder. I also had a small trail cam mounted on a tree about 20 feet from the shelter, angled to capture the roofline. This was a standard setup for monitoring wildlife, but it now served a different purpose. I packed up my gear, making sure to secure the shelter, and began the hike back to my cabin. The trail was slick with frost, and the forest felt unusually quiet. The radio remained silent, offering only static when I tried to reach dispatch. Once at my cabin, I immediately downloaded the audio and video files. The audio recording clearly captured the metallic pings, exactly as I remembered them, with the distinct stepping pattern. The sounds were undeniable. Then I reviewed the trail cam footage. The video showed the shelter roof, partially obscured by branches, but clear enough to reveal any significant movement. I watched the footage from the time the pings began. Nothing. The roof remained empty. No shadow, no movement, no visible source for the sounds. The camera's infrared vision showed only the static outline of the shelter and the surrounding trees. It was a blank, silent recording of an empty roof, while the audio track played the distinct, rhythmic pings. The discrepancy was unsettling. I reviewed the footage multiple times, frame by frame, but there was nothing to see. I compiled a detailed report, attaching the audio file and the photographs of the undisturbed snow. I noted the absence of visual evidence from the trail cam. My report was factual, procedural, and devoid of speculation. I sent it up the chain, knowing that such an account would likely be met with skepticism. The official response was brief and dismissive, suggesting animal activity or environmental factors, despite the lack of physical evidence. They filed the report, and the incident was closed. There was no further investigation, no follow-up. My logbook entry for that day remained a stark record of an unexplained event. The isolation of my work often meant that unusual occurrences were simply absorbed into the vastness of the wilderness, becoming just another unverified story. I still work that section of the trail, and I still check the shelters. Sometimes, when the air is particularly still and the night is especially cold, I find myself listening. I listen for that faint metallic ping, that deliberate stepping pattern on the roof. The memory of those sounds, and the complete lack of any explanation, remains with me.